All right, guys, here we go with Lincoln. Romance, Law, and Politics, Chapter 2. Lincoln, How Abraham Lincoln Ended Slavery in America by Howard Holzer. In Springfield, Lincoln's reputation as an attorney, that's a lawyer, and politician grew steadily. He found work as a junior partner in a law firm and became particularly adept at trial work. Juries loved his droll stories and deft arguments and often decided in favor of Lincoln's clients, even if the law was not on their side. Meanwhile, he continued to serve in the state legislature and began impressing audiences throughout the region with his talents as a public speaker. But Lincoln complained that social life in Springfield was a dull business, admitting, "I am quite as lonesome here as ever I was anywhere in my life. I have been spoken to by but one woman since I've been here, and should not have been by her if she could have avoided it." Romance finally arrived after 2 years in town. In around 1839, he met another Mary, a sparkling young woman named Mary Ann Todd, a cousin of his first law partner, John Todd Stewart. She had just moved to Springfield to live with her married sister, Elizabeth Todd Edwards. Mary's one and only goal was to find a husband, as she was already over 20 when she arrived, practically an old maid by the standards of the early 19th century. The Illinois capital was filled with eligible bachelors. Bachelors are unmarried men. And Mary was pretty and flirtatious enough to soon enjoy her choice of those. She was wildly popular at local parties and had men fluttering around her seeking her attention. One of those suitors was an up-and-coming politician named Stephen A. Douglas, who was in many ways the complete opposite of Abraham Lincoln. Appropriately, one became known as the Little Giant and the other as Long Abe. Douglas, the Little Giant, was as short as Lincoln was tall, as boastful as Lincoln was modest, and loved to smoke, eat, and drink more than was good for him. His neighbors already knew that Lincoln never used tobacco and never consumed liquor or wine. Rather than brag, Lincoln usually poked fun at his own homely appearance. From the first, the two rivals opposed each other in politics, too. Douglas was a Democrat. He worshipped former President Andrew Jackson and did not believe in big banks or government spending to build new roads. He believed such projects required higher taxes, which his supporters could ill afford to pay. Lincoln, on the other hand, was an enthusiastic member of the Whig Party. He supported road and canal projects that would link the state more closely and make it easier to ship goods from town to town. He favored a strong banking system that made certain that money remained in good supply. The issue of slavery had not yet divided Lincoln and Douglas, though eventually it would. Mary probably could have married the dynamic Stephen Douglas. He was certainly the more famous and successful of the two. She later boasted that he indeed became one of her admirers, but instead she set her sights on Lincoln, homely and awkward though he was. She saw something in him from the start that many others failed to recognize, a promise of future greatness. As she later said with pride, she may have had many suitors, but Lincoln was a world above them all. Yet theirs did not seem a natural match at the start of their friendship. It was said that Lincoln approached Mary at a party one evening and shyly declared, "Miss Todd, I want to dance with you in the worst way." As she later remembered, that was exactly the way he danced, in the worst way. But before long, Abraham and Mary were deeply in love and courting at Mary's sister's home. Abraham proposed and Mary accepted, but something happened before the wedding they planned for July 1st, 1841. Most likely, the groom got cold feet and backed out. Whoever was at fault, both took the breakup hard. Humiliated, Mary remained secluded at her sister's house and refused for a time to see anyone. Lincoln became so depressed that his friends feared he would take his own life. He was miserable, he said, mostly because he had wounded Mary's feelings. He felt he could not live with her, but could not live without her either. Abraham consoled himself by heading off to visit his one-time Springfield roommate, Josh Speed, at his family home near Louisville, Kentucky. There, Lincoln relaxed in comfort, waited on day and night by the Speed family's African-American slaves. If Lincoln felt any discomfort or guilt over the existence of slavery at the Speed plantation, he never said so. On his way home, accompanied by Speed on a steamboat to St. Louis, he witnessed a scene that disturbed him deeply and haunted him for the rest of his life. He had just boarded the canal boat when he glimpsed a group of slaves on deck. To Lincoln's horror, they were chained together. Yet they seemed incredibly happy, sang songs and cracked jokes, he recalled. But surely, Lincoln thought, They knew they had been taken away from their friends and family and were about to be sold in the South. They were chained 6 and 6 together, Lincoln vividly remembered. A small iron clevis, a U-shaped iron horseshoe with holes in it through which chains could be strung, was around the left wrist of each, and this fastened to the main chain by a shorter one at a convenient distance from the others, so that the others were strung together precisely like so many fish upon a trout line. In this condition, they were being separated forever from the scenes of their childhood, their friends, their fathers and mothers, their brothers and sisters, and many of them from their wives and children, and going into perpetual slavery, where the lash of the master is proverbially, proverbially more ruthless and unrelenting than any other wear. For years, he could not get that sight out of his mind. By then, millions of slaves were held in equally cruel bondage throughout the South, with no right to remain with their loved ones if their owners chose to separate and sell them. Much of the region was devoted to farming, and the largest farms, which were called plantations, grew acre after acre of cotton, rice, or tobacco, which required huge numbers of workers to plant and harvest, often in suffocating heat. The first slaves had arrived in Virginia in the early 1600s. Over the centuries, hundreds of thousands of black children had been born into slavery and continued to work on the plantations. Tens of thousands more were captured in Africa and brought to America against their will aboard slave ships so fearfully crowded and filthy that many died before they arrived. If they had lived, they were forced to work for no pay for the rest of their lives. They could not learn to read or get formally married. And if they had children, their sons and daughters became the property of their white masters for the rest of their lives, and moreover, could be taken from their parents at any time and sold away. In the North, where the climate was cooler than the South and the farms smaller, most people tended their crops themselves or with their families. Slavery disappeared in most northern states by the 1840s, and its economy grew more diverse under a dynamic system that depended on free labor. Lincoln never suggested that Southerners were more evil than Northerners supporting slavery. In fact, he often admitted that if their geography had been reversed, had Northerners lived in the South and Southerners in the North, they would have reversed their views on the slavery issue too. That did not mean Lincoln thought slavery was a good thing. He passionately believed in the free labor system, in the right of every worker to do well enough to eventually be able to work for himself, perhaps to even employ others. As he put it, free labor has the inspiration of hope, pure slavery has no hope. On this subject, Lincoln and his former fiancée agreed. Slavery was an evil, but it would be difficult to dislodge it from a region where it had so long existed. The rights and feelings of the slaves themselves were seldom part of the discussion, at least among the vast majority of white people. Slaves were considered property, and no property in the entire South was worth more than its millions of enslaved people. When Abraham and Mary first met, slavery no longer existed in Illinois, but the few black people who lived in Springfield worked as servants or laborers. They enjoyed few opportunities, even in a supposedly free city. Abraham Lincoln and Mary did not get back together for nearly a year and a half. A local newspaper editor and his wife finally encouraged them to start courting again. That means dating. Courting is a fancy old-fashioned word for going out with or dating. They started dating again at their house, away from the suspicious gaze of Mary's sister, who did not approve of Lincoln. There, the two renewed their friendship and rediscovered how much they had in common. They certainly shared a bond, because both had lost their mothers at an early age. Mary might have been livelier and more sociable than Abraham, but both of them loved books, poetry, and ideas. Most of all, they shared a passion for politics. Mary was a Whig, too. Whig is spelled W-H-I-G, and it's a political party that we don't really talk about today, but it's with a capital W, the proper noun. Mary was a Whig, too. In fact, her father, Robert S. Todd, was a rather famous Whig back home in Lexington, Kentucky. Mr. Todd was even friends with the great Kentucky Senator Henry Clay, and that may have been enough to sway Lincoln. Clay was his hero. But even after their long separation, the two remained very different, too. Mary was fiery and unpredictable, quick to laugh but easy to anger. Abraham was slow and steady and sometimes seemed to be daydreaming. He could read for hours without even glancing up from his book or newspaper, ignoring everyone and everything around him. Mary, on the other hand, needed constant attention. Most significantly of all, though, they both Originally hailed from the same state of Kentucky, they had been raised, but they had been raised in very different circumstances. Lincoln grew up in a primitive log cabin deep in the prairie. Mary grew up in a fine home in a city. Mary's family was wealthy, while Abraham's was poverty-stricken. Mary's father sent her to college. Lincoln's father allowed his son less than a year of actual schooling during his entire childhood. Perhaps the biggest difference between them was their personal childhood experience with slavery. Lincoln's father was too poor to afford slaves and disapproved of slavery on moral grounds anyway. But Mary's father did own slaves. In fact, Mary Todd was raised by an African American house servant she called Mammy Sally. They grew especially close after Mary's mother died. However, Mammy Sally was more than a servant. She was also something of a freedom fighter, risking her life to help other slaves escape through Lexington, even though, if she had been discovered, she might have been severely punished. Little Mary learned from Sally to sing the hymn, Hide me, O my Savior, a prayer for escaping slaves, and may have watched as Sally left coded message for escaping slaves in the form of kerchiefs or bandanas strung along the front fence of the Todd home. Mammy Sally may have inspired the young girl to think harder about what freedom meant, although for many years she would not think of African Americans as equals. But from an early age she knew how brutal slave life could be. Mary no doubt saw many slaves beaten at the town whipping post and heard stories about how many local people who viciously mistreated their slaves. Even her father came to hate slavery, but not enough to free his own slaves. Eventually, it was the subject of politics that brought Abraham and Mary back together. They both ardently favored the Whig Party and both disliked slavery, even if neither yet knew quite what to do about it. And it was one particular political crisis that finally inspired Abraham to take the leap where marriage was concerned. He had been writing a series of extremely sarcastic articles for the town newspaper, poking fun at local Irish American Democrat named James Shields. The articles were extremely hurtful, but in those days politicians often attacked each other personally, and Lincoln was no exception. After one such assault, Mary decided she wanted to get in on the exciting action too. She wrote and published a poem that ridiculed Shields just as cruelly, making particular sport of his Irish heritage. Outraged, Shields demanded to know who wrote the rhymes. Lincoln valiantly took the blame to protect Mary, and Shields demanded an apology. When Lincoln refused, Shields challenged him to a duel. Cooler heads eventually prevailed, and the fight was called off at the last minute, but Mary was deeply impressed by Lincoln's gallant behavior. Just a few weeks later, on November 1st, 1841, the two married in the parlor of Mary's sister's home. Politics had united two wildly different personalities and turned them into a single-minded couple for life. Now both would devote their time to the same goal, making Abraham Lincoln a success. For the rest of their lives, they never spoke of the near duel again. In any event, much bigger battles awaited them in the future. Chapter 3, tomorrow.